Hi, yeah. So we are in Parashat Lech Lecha, third parasha. And our starting point today is a short Torah from a book called Hayom Yom. So Hayom Yom is a small book that was edited by the Lubavitcher Rebbe before he was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, when he was just a son-in-law of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he took the many sayings that he would use to repeat, and he divided them across all the days of the year. So he made a book that for every day of a leap year, so it's full year, including all the months, that every day has a short Torah, short something to think about. And then the Torah for Gimel Cheshvan, if I'm not mistaken, which in that year was Lech Lecha, went like this. Very simple, but that's our springing board for this week's tour of the inner dimension of the parasha. So he says like this, says Parashat Bereshit started out very well, the world was created, everything was good, but then gradually things become worse until it ends up being very bad. And we always feel this when we read Bereshit. Starts out amazing, everything is very optimistic, and the world is created, everything is fresh. And then by the time we reach the end of the parasha, Hashem regrets having created everything, and he wants to wipe everything away with the flood. And then the second parasha, Noach, it says, deals with something very bad, very tragic, very terrible, which is the flood. But it ends with a happy note, because Avraham is born. And then Lech Lecha, finally, is the first parasha to be all good, because every day we're living with Avraham Avinu. That's the phrase that he uses. We're walking with Avraham, and he instills within us his spirit of Mesirut Nefesh, his willingness to give up his life if needed in order to tell the world about Hashem. And welcome.
Hey! Brought 2 cups of water. So, do you want some water also?
No, okay.
Okay, I can use that cup. Oh yeah? Okay, I was going to use that cup.
So, welcome. So we were just saying that in the Yom Yom for Gimel Cheshvan, it says that Parashat Bereshit starts good, but ends with has a bad ending, because Hashem wants to do the flood, and then Parashat Noach starts with the flood, but ends on a happy note because Avraham Avinu is born. And then Lech Lecha, the third parasha, starts good, and every day we live with Avraham Avinu, and how he was willing to do everything to tell the world about Hashem and about God. So now, just taking this small idea that there's something about the third parasha that combines elements from the first 2 parashot, and specifically that the first parasha starts well but ends badly, and the second parasha starts badly but ends well, then that reminded me and reminds a lot of people who sort of went into this stuff of one of the most famous and basic and very old, very traditional differences or definitions for what a tragedy and a comedy are. So we think today that tragedy is something sad, and comedy is something happy, and we think about the 2 masks, the laughing mask and the crying mask. And that's the universal symbol of comedy and tragedy. But one of the most fundamental and more abstract definitions, and traditional definition, does not necessarily talk about sad or happy, because that's too shallow. It says that the definition of a tragedy is that it starts good but ends bad, and the definition of a comedy is that it starts bad but ends good. That was one of the definitions. So a tragedy tells about someone whose life is an important person usually, and he has a status, and he has a lot of things going for him, and then for some reason or other, whether it's an internal flaw or something tragic in the world, but something is a turning point, and he deteriorates, and it ends badly, otherwise it wouldn't be a tragedy. And a comedy is about someone who, at the very early stage, something goes wrong, there's a complication, and then there's a misunderstanding, and maybe there's errors, and maybe there's it's taken for someone else, there's a problem, but at the end it's all solved. So in this sense we can think that maybe Bereshit is a little bit of a tragedy, and Parashat Noach is a little bit of a comedy, and Parashat Lech Lecha is somehow a combination of both. That in some way it starts like a tragedy, but in a good sense, because it starts good. But it ends like a comedy, obviously also in a good sense. But that's not a comedy. A comedy is to start bad. Noach is a comedy according to this definition. So that's the first thing so basically what we want to do this evening is we want to take a deep look at the three parashot, and especially Lech Lecha, and try to see them in this light, to think about what really is a tragedy and a comedy. What does it mean in a more deeper level? Also what it means in our lives, what happens when we perceive our lives as tragic, or as the opposite of tragic, as comical. What does it mean? And why does the culture is obsessed with these two genres? Why do people love tragedies? Why do people love comedies? And why is Lech Lecha, it may be a combination of both of them. So we started with this definition, which really goes along with this Torah from the Yom Yom. But there is another definition for what a comedy and a tragedy are, and what the difference is. And this comes from a very famous book by Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a book called The Poetics. And the whole book, the original book, was supposed to cover both tragedies and comedies, and he was supposed to analyze what each of them stands for and how they're structured and so on. But we end up only having the part about tragedy. That's all we have. And the second part about comedy was lost. So it had a tragic ending. The part of the comedy had a tragic ending. It was lost. And the tragedy had a good ending. It was saved. But we can see a little bit about what he wanted to say about comedy. So what's his definition? He's not stressing the idea of how it starts and how it finishes. He stresses that the difference lies in the protagonist. And he says this. He says a tragedy is about a great man. It's always about a great man. It's not just any kind of fellow. It's someone who's great, who's important, who's wise, who's above the average, who's far above everyone else. He's a king or a hero or a warrior or a nobleman. And he also aspires to great things. He doesn't want to keep things as they are. He challenges fate. He challenges the gods. He does something that he tries to break free of the mold of this world, and of what fate is supposed to take him down the road that fate is going to take him, but he fails. But it's part of the tragedy. It's not just by accident that it's about a great man. Greatness, there's something about greatness that leads to this kind of a tragedy, because you can't beat fate, and you can't challenge fate, and you can't win over nature. And there's something greater than you are, and because there's something greater than you are, then any attempt to be this great hero or warrior or someone who challenges his fate is doomed to fail. And why do we watch this? Why do we like this? Why do we enjoy this? Because we like experiencing intense emotions he talks about fear and mercy, of pity, fear and pity. We fear for his fate, that we know it's coming, and we identify with him, and also we feel pity over him. And really he doesn't say this, but really we're really thinking about ourselves. That we think that we are maybe also a little bit of tragic heroes, misunderstood by other people, and our great vision is nobody really understands it, and the world is not ready for who we are, and it sort of comforts us in some way to see this guy. He doesn't say this, but it's obviously there also. And then a comedy is exactly the opposite. It's about someone who's less than average. It's about someone who's very simple, who's not sophisticated, who's foolish or ugly or clumsy. There's something about him that's not, just exactly the opposite. And things get complicated for him. He's not looking for trouble. He's not looking to do something great in the world. He's looking to get along. He wants to have a simple, happy life. But it doesn't work out, but then it does work out in the end, and everything's okay. So it's not just, it goes along with the idea of starting well and ending badly, because the great figure of the tragic protagonist starts out well. He starts out with having something important in him and having an important position in life and so on, but it ends badly, and so it goes along, but the emphasis is now on the protagonist, not on the structure. And also, it's added that the tragedy and the comedy are meant for different people. The tragedy doesn't just talk about great figures, it talks to the higher level of society. It talks to the intelligentsia, to the people who are sophisticated, who are well-read, it's higher language. And these are the sort of people who like tragedies because they like seeing something that is deeper and more, in the sense that it's more honest. It looks at the world, it sees how the world is tragic and how things are dark. There's a dark element to the world and there are dark fates and so on. But the comedy doesn't just talk about a simple person. It talks to simple people also. It goes to the simple, it's populist. It talks to the everyman, everyday, who just wants some entertainment. It's basically entertainment, it's not art. And this duality is playing out in all of history. And we see it today also. We see there's something called the Hollywood ending. Hollywood ending this is a mass industry, it goes for most people, needs to make money, and it doesn't like tragedies very much. There are hardly any tragedies in Hollywood. It's not a Hollywood ending. Hollywood ending is when the hero gets the girl and the villain gets punished and everything is okay. And it's basically a comedy. It's basically a comedy, even when it's a bit more serious. And then you have art house movies, and art house movies, they're more lower budget and it's alternative and they don't screen at the usual, it's more the sophisticated sort of cinematheque. Now very interestingly, we live in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem we see it as the heart of the world. And so in many ways it symbolizes something significant about, I usually say this about that the Hebrew University is split into humanities and sciences, two different parts of the city. It symbolizes how the academic world is split. But there's another very symbolic thing about Jerusalem, which is, where is the art house cinema? That's the Cinematheque. Where is it located? It's located in a place called Gei Ben Hinnom. And Gei Ben Hinnom is the origin of the word Gehenom, which means hell. It was considered to be the opening of where hell is. And also in that place, in Gei Ben Hinnom, which is right below Emek Refaim, which also has to do with ghosts. And it's all this tragic atmosphere surrounding this place, because why? In the Cinematheque, people like to watch tragedies. And in fact, they would even say that if a serious movie or play or book or whatever, if it ends up suddenly having a happy ending, it seems like a cop-out. It seems like you didn't go all the way with what you should have done. And also in Gei Ben Hinnom, there was the Molech cult. The Molech cult in the Tanakh are people who used to sacrifice their children or to do rites of passage, very frightening rites of passage, to basically initiate the child into a tragic world. That the world is very hard and tough, so you need fire. And the children would scream and they would be drumming to drown out the screaming of the children. And that's the origin of another word for hell in Hebrew, which is Tofet. Tofet and Gehenom, the two words in Hebrew for hell. Tofet comes from tupim, from drums, and Gehenom is just a mixing, it's just a reading of the Gei Ben Hinnom, which is the place. So that's just a side note. So now, in a way, this second definition of tragedy and comedy also goes along with Bereshit and Lech in some ways. Why? Because Bereshit talks about great people. What I mean great people? First, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are the greatest people. They're not even real people. They're not even regular people. They don't have parents. They weren't born. They were created directly out of Hashem's hands. And that's the greatest people. And they sin and they fall. It's like a tragedy. The whole story of falling from the Garden of Eden. And then all of humanity, the first generations, they live for almost 1,000 years. They're the greatest people. And Hashem is among them, and Chanoch walks with Hashem and all this. And then so there's something about Parashat Bereshit, which also, it's not just that it starts well and ends badly, it also talks about the greatest people, the first generations, with the longest lifespans. So there's something, and And after the flood, in Noach, we see people becoming regular people. They have a regular lifespan, 120 years at the most. Noach is drinking, and even the Tower of Babel, which appears to be more a sort of tragic protagonist type of thing to do, to try and build a tower that goes all the way to heaven. In a way, it's all about celebrating humanity, not. It's to show that we as people are able to take bricks and build buildings. It's a monument to man. It's not a monument to something greater than man. So in a way, it's still part of the more comedic, so to speak, in the sense of regular people who just want to build a city and a tower, and they wanted to prevent another flood, or to make sure they see everything, or to give themselves a name or reputation. So in a sense, it also fits that the first parasha is tragic in the sense that it talks about these great souls who created the sin of the flood. And the second parasha is all about more human, regular souls who aren't as great, and they're full of... And also, after the flood ends, Hashem says, I know that man has the evil inclination in him since the moment he's born, and therefore I'll be more forgiving. I will never do another flood, because all people are just human. They have their... It's very similar to the comic character. Now, but all this is going to lead to Lecha being somehow a combination. So now we have to ask, like, what is this combination? But before asking what the combination is, we should say that there is something to be said. But before this, just looking at what is the philosophy, so to speak, or the worldview that the Greeks had when they had these two types of genres. When they had, on the one hand, high art, which has to be tragic art because it talks about great people doing great things but impossible things, and then it fails, and low art, popular entertainment art. What's the message here? What's the worldview that's implied by this? And the worldview is basically, ultimately, it's a tragic worldview. And the comedy is just a part of this tragic worldview. The worldview says that the world is limited. There are laws to nature, there are laws of fate, and no one can overcome them. Even the gods can't change the ultimate fate, and obviously not the humans or the demigods and so on. They're all part of this. And if they try to change it, it's going to end up fulfilling the prophecy. And this is an ultimately very tragic worldview. And that's why the legacy of Greece is far more the tragedies than the comedies. And again, that's the high art. That's the most, because there's a theology or a worldview here. The worldview is that the world is closed. It's a closed circle. It's a closed world. And if you try to go beyond it, if you try to break the barrier and change the future and bring something great into the world, greater than what the world allows for, it can't. It can't work. It's not going to work, and it's going to be a tragedy. And why? How come the comedic protagonist has a good ending? We can say, but there's also the other genres. You also have the comedies. They have a good ending. Yes, but the reason they have a happy ending is that no one aspires to anything really great. They just want the complication to be solved and the problem to be, that a solution will be found, that you get lost and you get found again, and you lose something and you gain it back again. And by the way, the image of the comedic hero, who is the most famous comedian of all time? The most famous, like the symbol of comedy in the 20th century. Everyone knows him. The most famous, the most iconic comedian, Charlie Chaplin. So Charlie Chaplin, his character is called a tramp. He's a very simple person. He doesn't aspire to anything. He's a vagabond. He's satisfied. He can eat grass. He can eat shoes. Whatever is there, he has no, and it works out for him. Why does it work out? So ultimately, the comedy strengthens the narrative of the tragedy, because it shows us the only way to have a happy ending is when you think small. If you're going to think big, it'll be a tragedy. But you have to think, if you think small, then it'll work out, and you can be a small person but very happy. But if you want to be a great person, it's not going to work because that's how the world is. And that's why people feel, the more sophisticated people, that they like to watch the art house movies with the terrible endings, and they look at the dark side of the world and the soul. They feel that that's honest. That's real. In a way, and you can even see that if someone makes a movie that's realistic and honest, brutally honest, as people say, but then finally there's a happy ending, people would say, he copped out at the very end. It's like saying there is a God, and the God is the God of absurd, the God of tragedy. That's the real God, that's the real world. It's run by an evil God, and we have to bow down to the evil God and do tragedies. And if you do a comedy, then either you're just looking at a small picture, or you copped out at the end and you bowed before the avodah zarah of optimism. Optimism becomes the avodah zarah of this kind of tragic worldview. Now, before we go to Lech Lecha and say that we want to maybe get a combination, we have to say something lelamed zchut about this. And how can we lelamed zchut? We can say this. We can say that there's something very true about this duality, this either-or choice. And this either-or choice is, by the way, there was a Danish philosopher, his name was Kierkegaard, 19th century. And he had a book called Either Or. And the book Either Or was 2 volumes. The first volume was the either, and the second volume was the or. And it was all about his dilemma, whether he should go, that's the either. The first scenario is that he would be an artist for the rest of his life, and he would live a tragic lifestyle. He would go all the way to whatever it takes him, and he would explore the anguish in his heart, because art is all about expressing your anguish. And it's going to be a hard life, but very authentic and very aesthetic. He would go for the aesthetic in the sense of exploring, going into art all the way. But the other option, second volume, which is just as long, is the option of getting married and raising a family. And there's a woman who she wants to marry him, but it doesn't go with going all the way into art. And that's the venue of the ethical. There's the aesthetic and the ethic. And going into the ethical, and so how do we call these 2 versions? And why is there a reason why the first is tragic and the second one is? So in Kabbalah and Chassidut, we call this the world of Tohu and the world of Tikkun. And what is the world of Tohu? The world of Tohu is defined as having great lights, visions, ideas, things you want to bring to the world, things that are beyond things that you see here. But the vessels are undeveloped and narrow and childish and not realistic and not connected to what life is really able to contain. And what happens to the world of chaos? It breaks. It's a tragedy. The root of tragedy, of all tragedies, is in what in Kabbalah is called the world of Tohu. Tohu is the primordial chaos, but the primordial chaos, according to Kabbalah, is really the highest of lights, the most incredible of light, which is why we feel that sometimes tragic art is deeper, it resonates, touches something deeper, because it touches the greatest of lights. It touches Hashem where we don't understand Him fully, where He's not promising anything. It touches the infinity of Hashem. It touches what is beyond our control. But the world of Tohu is tragic in the sense that all these lights, the vessels are unprepared for them and they break. And going for this is the opposite of choosing life. Uvacharta b'chaim. So we can say there's something true about this duality. When we are at a crossroad of being an eternal student, an eternal artist, an eternal wanderer, who never settles down, this is ultimately a tragic lifestyle. It's full of lights of experience and emotion and desires, but the lights don't sit in vessels, and they break the vessels, and people like this, they die young. They die of overdose, they die of whatever dangerous thing they're doing, and that's what happens to them. There is something true about tragedy. If you try to go for lights that don't have vessels, you really there's something very true about this. And what you should do is you should go for the world of Tikkun. The world of Tikkun is the opposite. It has broad, steady, flexible, realistic vessels, and it means doing compromise with other people and with the world, And it goes with, again, a compromise in lights. There's great vessels, but fewer lights. That's what it means. And that's what the Danish philosopher knew when he wrote the either or. He says, if I'm going to get married, I will have a wife and a family and children, and it'll be the world of tikkun. The world of tikkun is rectification. It'll be a rectified world, but I won't have all the lights that I feel that are calling me as an artist. So these two versions are in many ways tohu and tikkun, and we know that we should move away from tohu and move towards tikkun. So it appears like the Torah world, or the Jewish world, or the Torah is telling us that it really is like this, and we have to choose for the comedy. We have to go for the comedy, to go for something that's realistic, and that we have to live with the mitzvot, not to die with the mitzvot. On the other hand, if you think about it, when Chazal talk about the two parashot, the two first parashot talk about the first 2,000 years of mankind, of the world and mankind. And the Chazal say that the first 2,000 years of the world, they called it Shnei Alafim Tohu. All the 2,000 years are Tohu. So that's interesting, because now we see that the first 10 generations leading up to Noach and the flood, that was Tohu, because that was a tragedy. That's the first parasha. Starts well, ends badly. That's Tohu. And in fact, it takes up more than a millennium and a half. The flood is about 1,656. And so it's more than 1,500 years. It's the majority of the 2,000 years. But then Noach, that appears to be the world of comedy and the world of tikkun, because it starts bad and ends well, because it's more human, because it ends with Avraham and so on, we would think that's the world of tikkun. But no, it's part of the 2,000 years of Tohu. So there's a hint here that although we could say that Noach building an ark, surviving the flood, settling the world, they settled the world, they don't end up, even when they sin, then Chazal say they sinned, at least why was no one killed in the punishment for the Tower of Babel? Because Gadol HaShalom, they cooperated, they worked together, they were a very advanced civilization. They had a good one language, they had technology. It's the world of tikkun. Why is it part of the 2,000 years of Tohu? So there's something that is sort of hinting and telling us that even this kind of tikkun, the comedy lifestyle, not aspiring too much, thinking small, just building your home, not thinking about the great lights of Tohu, we would think it's a great thing, he went for tikkun, that's wonderful. That this is also a kind of Tohu. Why is it a kind of Tohu? Because as long as we're in the either or mentality, just the first two parashot, it's two parashot. A third parasha is a third path. It's a middle ground, it's another option, it's a combination. But before we have the third, like the third line of the Sfirot, we have one and the other. Before we have the third element, which creates, so although the first one is obviously Tohu, and the second one is more Tikkun, the fact that we're still in the world of duality means we're still in a Tohu world, in a chaos world. And in fact, in Kabbalah, the definition for the world of chaos is that it only has the left axis of the Sfirot and the right hand axis of the Sfirot, and it doesn't have the middle one. There's no middle ground, there's no combination. That was the Kierkegaard's dilemma in the either or, and that's what we have when we just look at the first two parashot. So they're all Tohu. Even the Tikkun is part of a greater Tohu, unrectified reality in which we think you either go to a tragedy, and that was the Greek mentality also. If you want to go to high art, go to the Athens Cinematheque and watch a tragedy. And if you want to be entertained, then go see one of the comedies. But there's no middle ground. Even when it was later invented, the word tragicomedy, which was invented, I saw today as I was preparing the class, by a Roman playwright of comedies. So he wrote it as part of a comedy, and it's no coincidence that the noun is comedy and tragedy is the adjective, tragicomedy in one word. Because it was more like a comedy with a bit of tragic elements or something that had to do with tragedy. But there's no real combination. But we believe and this is an important notion in Kabbalah and Chassidut, that why is the world of Tikkun also, in a way, still part of the 2,000 years of Tohu, part of the world of Tohu? Because that's not the ideal, the world of Tikkun. Tikkun is just a step, it's just a stage. The ideal is something called, is a combination. It's called lights of Tohu, lights of chaos, in vessels of Tikkun. We somehow have to take the higher lights of tragedy. Tragedy deals with the higher lights. It's no coincidence that it's a more sophisticated form of art, that it resonates as something that it echoes something deeper about human nature and the world. And it's just that it ends up saying that the world is tragic and everything is tragic and the world is run by an evil God or by no God at all. So that we don't agree with, but the lights that are in there, the sparks, are very high. And the comedy that hopes and aims at a happy ending, and also has a hero that's humble, that he doesn't think of himself as something greater than what he is. There's something also good that's better vessels, and a combination of lights of Tohu with vessels of Tikkun, lights of chaos with vessels of rectification, would have to combine it's really lights of tragedy in vessels of comedy. Mm-hmm. Tragedy lights in comedy vessels. And this was all hinted at by this Yom Yom that talks about Lech Lecha being a combination of both. So now let's move on to Lech Lecha. We maybe just say one thing before this. One more final thing is that really, I said this a little bit before, but when the sophisticated audience goes to see a tragedy, what they really enjoy is that they're thinking of themselves. Ultimately, if you peel down the enjoyment, it's not just the fear and the pity and the catharsis and the emotions. It validates my own self-image that I'm really a tragic hero. And I'm a victim. I'm a victim of the fact that my soul is greater than this world. That I have something about me nobody can understand and appreciate, and I have to walk to my death, with this lonely, tragic halo surrounding me. And no, don't follow me, don't try to tell me, and all this. It's really, ultimately what we really worship or enjoy the tragedy. When you peel everything down, it validates my ego and my sense that I am, and when I feel that I'm a victim, that I'm a tragic hero, I forgive myself for all my flaws. I don't have to change anything. And I can be angry, I can look down at other people because I think of myself as this great tragic hero. The comedy...
Not everything revolves around you.
Yeah. And this is why it's so tragic, and nobody can comfort me because nobody can understand me and so on. And again, there's something deep about it, but there's also this, and this is really the heart of it. And comedy doesn't give me that. Comedy gives me someone who's very humble, who's satisfied with what he has, and it doesn't aspire to anything else. So again, now we want to combine all this. Now what happens in Lech Lecha with Avraham? So we start out with a man who, not at a young age, is told by Hashem, Lech Lecha. Now just this Lech Lecha, which means he grew up in one world, and it's words of idol worshippers. And what are the idol worshippers? What do they worship? They worship nature. Nature. In Hebrew, the word teva comes from the root of the word tabat, which is ring, a circle. Teva is, nature is circular. And there's cycles of nature, cycles of day and night, and the year, and the seasons. And you can never change that. History is bound to repeat itself. It's one big circle of eternal repetition. It's the myth of eternal repetition. It's the classical myth that is really the root of all tragedies, that the world is like one big circle. And when the Rambam, Maimonides, talks about the world before Abraham, he says that once everyone forgot about God and they started worshipping the idols, the world would turn and turn and turn until there appeared the pillar of the world, Abraham. And it very clearly is using the image of a wheel and then of a pillar, which is moving from a circle to a line. Lech Lecha is creating a line that breaks the circle. The fact that Abraham is able to break his father's idols, to go against where he grew up, Lech Lecha me'artzecha moladcha me'beit avicha, from your country and your birthland and the house of your father, and you leave everything behind you, and you create a line. The word for line in Hebrew, kav, is the root of the same word. It's the root of the word hope, tikva. Tikva is the opposite of tragedy. You can see the word as a tragedy if you think it's all this circle. But if you say, no, I can break out of this circle, and I can draw a line, and I can do lech lecha, go to you, go to yourself, go for you, go for your higher future self. And it's different than your past self. You can go in a different direction. You're not bound by the past. You're not bound by circumstances. You're not bound by nature. All this is it's optimistic, but that's the beginning of the tragic hero. Because the tragic hero, that's what he tries to do. He tries to go beyond what he was ascribed or assigned by fate. But he believes, they all believe, the Greeks, that it can't work. So he tries it. It's futile. It can't work. So again, Avraham, Lech Lecha starts like a tragedy, right? It starts well and ends well. It starts like a tragedy. So he's taking off with the same starting point as the tragic hero. I'm not settling for this. I'm not going to settle down and be just an okay person and do what's expected of me and go in the footsteps of my father and maintain this circle of lies that I can't stand anymore. I'm going to rebel. And this rebelliousness is the tragic protagonist's mentality and his trait. It's the trait of a tragic hero, but it's not yet tragic. The tragic hero doesn't start out tragic. He starts as very optimistic, but it doesn't work out for him. So he breaks out, and then he goes through trials, and he goes on. And regarding Noach, it was said, Et ha'elokim italech Noach. Noach walked with God. God told him where to go, and he went alongside with him. He told him, build an ark, save yourself and your family. He did so. He didn't argue, because he was a comic hero. He didn't aspire to anything beyond what he was told. He was told to build an ark and save himself. He built an ark and saved himself and his family. He never once suggested maybe Hashem should save Avraham, because he's a comic hero. He thinks in a small circle. Well, he is tzaddik compared to his generation, but he's still a comic hero in the sense that he doesn't initiate anything different. But Avraham does initiate. When Avraham is told, next parasha, that Hashem is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he argues. He says, maybe you should save it, maybe you shouldn't. Right, the famous image is that Noach is a tzaddik with a fur, and Avraham is a tzaddik with a furnace, with an oven, not an oven. How do you say an oven is for cooking, for heating? A heater. Yeah, so furnace is nice, fur and furnace. So the idea is that when you're cold, you can heat yourself in two ways. You can put a fur and then you become warm, but everyone else stays cold, and you can light a fire. And Noach thought small, so he was told, put on fur, and he put on fur, he put on the ark. But Avraham, when he was told that this tragedy, this great punishment is going to happen, he started arguing and judging Hashem. That is not walking with Hashem, it's walking before Hashem. That's what Hashem tells him. Walk before me. Hitalech lefanai. I want you to initiate. I want you to argue with me. I want you to think beyond what I'm telling you. I want you to be yourself. I want you to be like the tragic protagonist, and I'm going to make sure it's not going to be a tragedy for you, because I'm the real ruler of the world, not the tragic God. There is a landlord to the city behind the fire, behind the palace burning. There is someone that's taking care of it. It's not the whole story about everyone seeing a palace burning and says there has to be. I don't believe this world is tragic. It can't be a tragedy. I have emunah, I have faith, but I still want. He's not the comedic hero. He's not the tramp who just wants to get by and have a small home and retire. He wants to change the world. He wants to turn the world into a world of believers, of people connected to Hashem. So he does the Lech Lecha, which is the line. He walks before Hashem. He argues with Hashem. And then the final element of this combination, that he has the ability and the aspiration to go beyond what he's prescribed in the beginning, and yet that it would lead to would end happily, not just start happily, it would end like a comedy, is in the covenant of the circumcision. Because then Hashem tells him, go out and count the stars, and we picture him coming out of the tent and looking at the stars, but Rashi gives us two very famous midrashim. One is, come out, not come out of your tent, but come out of your astrology. Stop believing the astrologers. He was himself an astrologer. And he looked at the stars and he saw that there's fate. The world is tragic. Specifically, his and Sarah's stories is tragic because the stars told him that Avram and Sarai can never have children. They're sterile forever. At least Sarai, as a couple, they're sterile. He had a son, but he's not the inheritor. And Hashem told him, get out of your astrology because there's something beyond the laws of nature. The world isn't tragic. I'm controlled. I can change your names and it will change your fate. There is a way, the line of Lech Lecha goes all the way out of the world and beyond the stars and beyond the astrology and beyond the laws of astrology is here, the realistic scientific view of the time. And then the other explanation Rashi gives is that by telling him, go out and count the stars, he took Abraham outside of the world. He took him outside of the space of the world. He took him beyond space and time to a place above the stars, and he looked at the stars from above. Go out and count the stars means go out of the world and count the stars from above, and you'll see that the stars, which is nature, which is the laws of nature, that's the source of the tragic worldview, isn't the end of the story. It's just the space, but there's an infinite light beyond the space. And this is the moment in which Abraham, who believed in this all of his life, because he went through all the trials, and he never lost his faith, and Sarah a little bit falls into the tragic trap, because when the angels come next parasha, and they tell Abraham that he was going to have a son, although he's 99 and she's 90, then she laughs. But it's the bitter laugh. It's not a positive laugh. It's a bitter laugh because she laughs. She says, haha, of course it's not going to happen. She's echoing the laughter of fate, the bitter, harsh, brutal laughter of fate that tells no chance, despair. You can't do it. And so what we see in Abraham, but then she ends up realizing that it really can happen, and she also becomes a believer. So what we see in Abraham is something very, very beautiful, which again, we started with the Yom Yom, that with two parashot, and Lech Lecha is a combination, but we see it's a combination in far deeper ways than we could have imagined. It's because Abraham is a combination of the tragic protagonist and the comic protagonist. From the tragic protagonist, he takes the belief that there's more to life than this. And I didn't come to this world just to settle down and be a mediocre person. I'm a soul that is rooted in the infinite light of Hashem, and I should take life very seriously. We're told about Abraham, Shu Baba Yamim, which means he was old age. He reached old age, but it also means that he came into every day and made it significant. And that's because he was in his heart, a great figure like the tragic protagonist. But it took from the comic protagonist the lowliness and humility and humbleness of someone who says, I'm not really the protagonist. I'm just doing this. Hashem is the protagonist. I'm doing it for him. And this is what happens in the covenant of circumcision. Because circumcision is when you're willing to diminish yourself in order to make room for something beyond you. The covenant of circumcision is both making room for Hashem. It's not just about me, it's about I'm part of something greater, which is Hashem. So I'm like the tragic hero in the sense that I want to be connected to this. I don't want to leave it to other people, to Hashem. I have to be part of this, I have to play a part. But on the other hand, I'm not the focal point here. The focal point is him, and I'm just making room for him. And it's also making a room for your spouse in a way, because it's the same organ of the union of man and woman, which means that he diminishes his own sense of self which is what the tragic hero has, and the audience of the tragedy, likes to feel itself and to experience itself as being this great, misunderstood tragic hero. But diminishing that is making you more like Chaplin's tramp, someone who is. There's something also very amusing about a 99-year-old man circumcising himself, and it's not coincidence. There's something funny about this. Something strange and funny that suddenly he has to do this change, and you need to take yourself not very seriously in order to do this in some way. You need to say, like, you know yourself so much, you feel yourself to be so whole, and then I can take something away, and there's something. That's why it ends it starts like a tragedy, it ends like a comedy, and that's why it's all good. So there's something. It's just very beautiful about this combination that and if we're in this atmosphere of theater, then we have a famous writer, who wrote the modern tragedies, were the Greek tragedies, but who was the greatest modern tragedy playwright? Greatest, biggest playwright of all time. Shakespeare, yeah. Yeah, so Shakespeare said, the world is stage, and everyone should play its part. But we should add just one more sentence to this. The world is a stage, and we should all play a part. That means you're not going to be like the comic hero who's not looking for anything. You want to play a part, you want to do something significant. But you have to add a line, and there's always a replacement. Don't think that it's all up to you. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, ve'en ata rashay libatel mena. You don't have to finish the job, but you can't run away from it. You have a job to do, you need to do it. You need to play the part, you need to take your life seriously, you need to go for the big lights, but in a way that's circumcised, that's diminished, that's humble, that's saying, well, it's not up to me to finish, and if I don't do it, someone else will, because I'm not the... There's a beautiful story that I heard recently, that in the first days of the State of Israel, the first president, called Menussi, the president of the State of Israel was called Zalman Shazal. And Shazal is Shneur Zalman something, and he came from a Chabad family, like many of the great Zionists. But he was secular, he was Zionist. And in his home, in the Bet HaNassi of that time, every week there was a shiur, a Torah class for David Ben Gurion and him, and Gershom Sholem, and all the greatest professors of the Hebrew University. And the teacher was this Chabad rabbi, and he would teach them every week Torah. And the greatest people came there, and they were all quite old. And then he felt that he was too old and too weak to do this, and he looked for someone to replace him. And then he approached this very young, unknown rabbi. At the time, was 30-something. His name was Adin Steinsaltz. And he asked him to take his place and to continue. It's not a class that you stop with all these important people. And Rabbi Steinsaltz was very hesitant because he was very young, and the people were very old and important and well-known. And so he wrote the Rebbe. And he told the Rebbe, I don't know if I should do this. And the Rebbe told him, don't worry, they're not coming there to listen to you. They're not coming there for you. They're coming there to listen to the age-old wisdom of Torah, which is being passed down from generation to generation. And you happen to be the final link in the chain for these people at that situation. And after you, it'll be someone else. And you're the last, so that's beautiful. He's telling, go, hitalech lefanai, go to these people who are greater than you, and don't be afraid, and this is your shlichut. But you should think of yourself as the last link in a chain. You should think of yourself like the comedic hero, not like the tragic hero. So you aspire for great things, but you do it in a way that you maintain the humility of someone saying, I'm not doing this for me, which means that if I fail, nothing tragic happens. I'm still going on, just like Abraham did.
But the Rebbe also says, midgets and giants' shoulders. That picture, I wonder if that relates also to this idea of being the last link in this.
Yeah, I want to be higher than previous generations. That means I aspire to something. But I also think of myself as very small compared to them. It's not, and it's all by virtue of them. It's all because I wouldn't have been able to do anything without them, and I can only see farther because I stood on their shoulders. So we started out with the Yom Yom and just how it starts and how it ends, but we see now that there's really something far deeper going on. That Lech Lecha is a combination of the first two parashot. That's really the first parasha of rectification, of tikkun. We would think that Noach is already the beginning of rectification. but it's still situated within a broader context. There's still a tohu context of either or, of the tragic heroes of the first parasha, and the comedic choose life, but a life that ends up Noach being drunk in his tent. Because when you think too small, that's what happens. You become a man of the earth, you become something very too earthly. And the Migdal Bavel is also, it's this great feat of humanity, of mankind, but it's all about preserving the physical, natural order of things. And in fact, it was said that they built the tower in order to prevent another flood from happening, because they thought the flood was a recurring natural phenomena. They were still trapped. They're still all trapped. Like I said before, that in Greece, tragedy affirms the tragedy. It tells us happy ending is only possible in a local context. In a global context, it's all tragic. So Abraham is really the founder of the true tragicomedy, and we can call the title of this class is the Divine Tragicomedy, because there was this famous work of art called the Divine Comedy, La Divina Commedia. And what is the Divine Comedy? It was written by 13th century Italian poet Dante. It wasn't a comedy at all. It wasn't funny in any way. It just describes a journey from hell to heaven. That's why it's called a comedy. And it's a divine comedy because it goes all the way to God. It goes from the bottom of hell to the uppermost level of heaven where God is. And this whole idea, it comes from Christianity, which comes from Judaism, which comes from Abraham. There could never have been this notion of a divine comedy. It's always weird to listen to that combination. What does it mean? So that's what it means. It means it's a very serious poem, epic poem, but it talks about, it just goes from bad to good. And he talks about, and it's a simple man. He's a regular man. He's talking about himself. Dante is just a poet. He's not old. He's 35. And he wants to know Hashem, and then he goes through this journey led by other people. All this was copyrighted by Avraham Avinu. He made this novelty that you can combine the two and create the true divine tragicomedy. And it has to do with the circumcision, the sense that this is where you diminish yourself in order to be, and then you're able to do the greatest of things without feeling that you're the tragic hero, which this is what turns it into a tragedy, when it's about you. But if it's not about you, it's about Hashem, and He changes your name, and He gives you children, and He gives you everything, and you're just here trying to bring some of His light into the world, then the tragedy ends up being a comedy. It starts like tragedy and ends up a comedy. And the final thing is that we can see all this very, very beautifully in the story by Rabbi Nachman about Chacham ve'atam, the wise man and the simple man. It's a beautiful repetition of this idea that the wise man is really the tragic hero. He's so wise, he thinks about himself all the time. He wants to work in every profession, to do everything, and he deteriorates more and more. But the Tam, who's willing to do the circumcision, who's willing to think of himself very in lowly terms, and he ends up gradually growing and becoming very important, and he ends up having all the wisdom of the Chacham, but in a far more rectified way. So he accepts the invitation to come to the palace and to meet the king and to rise up. He accepts this because he's willing to do great things. He's not the regular comic hero who doesn't want. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
And I think also it touches the one final thing is that it's when we think about our own lives, and there are a lot of sort of junctions in life in which we see that there's one way that goes in the direction of a lot of light, a lot of excitement, a lot of freedom, but it ends up being something, we know that it leads to tragedy in the sense that it doesn't really build our lives properly. And then we have the other option, which is thinking more in smaller terms, not aspiring to too much, more connected to the vessels. Then obviously we should choose the second one because it chooses life, but we shouldn't do it in a way that we give up on all the lights of freedom. We should do it in a way because then we just become the tramp, Charlie Chaplin, and that's not what the world was created for. And that's why Avraham is all about Lech Lecha and breaking his father's idols and not accepting the fate ascribed to him. You want something greater, and that's why we're here for. And if you constantly remember this, if we're not doing whatever it is we were meant to do, then it's a big waste of everyone's time and our own soul's energy. But we just have to do it in a way that it takes from the comedic hero the humility and the self-humor and the willingness to fall down and get up again happily and go on. And that is the key to taking all the great lights of our souls and turning it from a tragedy to a comedy.
Thank you so much. Wow, beautiful.
So that's our shiur for Lech Lecha.
Mm.